She's not mine.
I'm going to ask you to all take your seats because, as usual, we're going to be pitilessly punctual, also because of the people on live stream and also because so we have more time to speak. I'm Paola Antonelli. I've been working here at the Museum of Modern Art for 24 years. And I have learned my English and how to express myself while I was here. I mean, I'm Italian originally. And for a very long time, I have been thinking that the only way for me to survive and thrive in the United States was to only read and write in English. And I have discovered, as many of you, I'm sure, have discovered in your like travels or even in your learning of other languages, words do matter, as do languages. They really change the way you think and the way you also act in the world. This is an introduction to this night's salon. There's room, come. It's like really easy, so you don't have to worry. You can just like let people get up and down, no problem. It's an introduction to tonight's panel, tonight's salon. As you know, these salons have been going on for a long time. You know, MoMA R&D Salons, as I always say, MoMA R&D is a lot of R and very little D, but the R is really you know, passionate. And we take topics that might seem really highfalutin. We talk about death, we talk about the future, we talk about truth, and we try to show how the museum, and especially the Museum of Modern Art, can help people deal with such important matters in life. You know, so how to use the museum for such big matters in life. And words are extremely important. Lately, words have become even more important because they have come under attack, or at least they have been used as weapons more often than usual. Now, tonight, we're going to do something that maybe experts on linguistics will find blasphemous. We're going to switch a little bit between words and languages, not that haphazardly, but somehow in a not very educated way. But we're thinking of vessels of content and meaning. We're thinking of the minimal units, therefore also ideograms. We'll talk about emojis as well. And we'll also look up at the next structure, which is the structure of language. But throughout tonight, we will be talking about the importance of words, about how they matter in our society and in our culture, and we have some great experts to discuss that with. Now, of course, this is the Tower of Babel, and the Tower of Babel is a very important myth. It comes from Genesis, it comes from the Bible, and as you know, it was about humans building a tower that was way too high and that therefore was too arrogant for God to accept. And so because of that, God just cursed humans with too many languages. All of a sudden, he made humans not understand each other. And that's really the conundrum that words represent to us. We need language, we need words in order to structure our life and communicate, but at the same time, words are very often the basis and the cause for conflict. And, you know, lately, it's been that way many times. Erica Petrillo is the research assistant that works with me on the R&D salons, and she pointed at this thing that happened in December 2017 when the State Department and especially the Health Department was forbidden from using in next year's budget the words vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and hear this, science-based. We're talking about the health department. So it's clear that this was an almost Orwellian kind of situation. That's why here we have a quote from George Orwell, 1984. As you know, Newspeak is the language of Oceania, and it's a language where any negative nuance is completely banned, so there's no way to talk about anything negative or conflictual. And Newspeak is about narrowing the range of thought, because that's what happens when you narrow the range of words or you direct the range of words, you also narrow the way people think. And you might remember that Bush's guru, Frank Luntz, was exactly about that. He's the one that changed the estate tax into the death tax, and that changed global warming into climate change. And it was really interesting because that was one of the first times that this kind of manipulation of language was pointed at. But the politics of labeling and the politics of naming is extremely important and ever present in our life. Now, the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker has a trickle-down effect that means two very different lives that start at the border and then continue in how a person is absorbed and also embraced in a new country. Not to mention what we have seen happen in the past few days when we had what happened at Gaza, and the New York Times talked about Palestinians dying, and therefore afterwards there was an upsurge in social media that demonstrated, or at least pointed out at the fact that they didn't simply die, but they were killed, and correlating what happened in Jerusalem with the new embassy with this upsurge of violence. Please come, don't worry about a thing. It's really fine, yes. So words are a human creation, and therefore their meaning is based on conventions. And these conventions have a very big political weight. Another very important example of how words are used is actually the gender markers. Anne Garetta is a writer from France that wrote a novel that is called Sphinx, that is completely avoiding any kind of gender markers. So there are two protagonists, and in particular there's one protagonist that is a white theology student of bourgeois upbringing, a asterisk, 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 that is falling in love with an African-American cabaret dancer from Harlem. Now, if you try and read some pages, it's really interesting to see how one can achieve such feat as to completely avoid gender markers and have a narrative that is understandable and is also can be appreciated. So it's really fascinating. And tonight we're going to hear, we also have some interstitial videos that are Erica's introduction into the salons, her invention, and we're going to have Garetta's translator. They both go by the pronoun she and her, and she will talk about what it means to translate into English a French non-gender marked novel. So it's really quite fascinating. Another interesting demonstration of the fact that words are conventions goes back to the Iliad, where Homer talked about a wine-dark sea. The wine-dark sea of Homer has puzzled scholars and translators for centuries. And it was really interesting because there was a 19th century British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, that posited in the studies on Homer that the Greeks had a form of color blindness, and their optical palette was limited to black and white and possibly red, right? So other people said, oh yeah, it was a type of algae that the Greeks had in their sea, and that's why the Aegean Sea was wine red. Other people said it was the alkaline water common to the Peloponnesus that had turned red wine into blue. Some other people said that maybe it was an unusually vivid sunset. But you know, this thing was coming up 5 times in the Iliad. And then some people at last said, oh, you know, the phrase is just meaningless. It was just a great turn of phrase. So it's really fascinating because words can puzzle, especially if spoken or pronounced or written by a great writer, then can puzzle for centuries. Words also, as you know very well, are fluid. Every year we have different metrics, different declarations of the word of the year. There's the Google Trends links the appearance of the word to the trends that are happening in society. And you see there the diagram for crisis that, of course, has a very strong uptick in 2008. And then, of course, we have the word of the year, the WOTI, that comes from different sources, but the one that is most trusted is, of course, the Oxford English Dictionary. In that case, it's a board of lexicographers, of linguists that decide what the word of the year is. And in a way, they try to capture the zeitgeist of the year. They try to actually find a way to make sure that people can recognize and mirror themselves in this word. So the word is a mirror of society and of the zeitgeist. And I think that last year it was truth, if I'm not mistaken. Huh? Post-truth. Oh, mine. I was being kind of optimistic. So last year it was post-truth. And actually, for the Oxford Dictionaries, the word of the year also was youthquake, right? So youthquake and post-truth. And then there's the, oh, I'm sorry, I have to go back. There's the Global Language Monitor that instead moves up to phrases. And last year it was in particular the Weinstein effect. and me too. And actually, of course, this is very Anglo-centric, of course. Otherwise, if we went to other languages, we probably had different mirrors. So it cannot be completely universal. Of course, also, certain words can capture the zeitgeist onto itself. Luke, are you here? Luke Dubois, yeah, there he is. The artist is here. Hello, Luke. So this is a great great work from 2008 that's called Hindsight is Always 2020 that looks at various annual State of the Union speeches by various presidents and looks, makes a eyesight chart showing the ones that are most frequent or most heightened, and you see there we have J.W. Bush, terror is the biggest, Abraham Lincoln, emancipation, Benjamin Franklin, wages. Is it Franklin? Yeah. Benjamin, Harrison, I'm so sorry. And then Ronald Reagan, it's deficits. So it's very interesting to see it rendered in this way. But whenever politicians use words, they use them, as we know very well, as a weapon, and sometimes in a repetitive manner that really drills them into people's minds and has a ripple effect. Of course, also, there's another side of the medal. Words are fluid and they can be used, but they can also disappear. It's the other side of the coin. Now, I don't think you can see this slide very well from where you are, but I really hope that you will be able to go back to the speech and look at it in detail, because it's fantastic. It's the Eskimo words for snow. And it really is fascinating. There's something like there's a pink snow, green snow, there's fried snow, don't ask. There is no between your fingers or toes or in groin folds. Yeah, exactly. Snow mixed with the shit of a lead dog. And, it's quickly accumulating snow that doesn't stick. It's fantastic. And that shows really the richness that we lose when we lose languages. And that's something that Lena will discuss very much tonight. And on the right-hand side, you see the University of Utah researchers have developed an amazing way with the stop photography to actually take pictures of snowflakes while they fall. It's quite beautiful. This is also, you might have heard of Robert McFarlane's Landscapes. It's a book that appeared last year and that became a bestseller when The Guardian published its first chapter, calling it The Word Horde. But he basically captured many different ways to describe the languages in many different, describe the landscape in many different languages. And there are ways that are actually disappearing. That is quite beautiful, like fast-moving storm clouds like the ones we saw last night here, or mist that is slowly clearing, or a path in the mountains in Gaelic. So the beauty of words that are almost a poetry unto their own. They're more than haiku. Every word really renders completely a whole landscape of the mind and of the earth. Now, words can also be used for dissent. There is right now a beautiful exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum that is Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960-1985. And we see in that particular case a lot of different uses of words for dissent. There's a whole chapter of the exhibition that is devoted to that, because we know Latin America went through a period where speaking and using words was really taking your life into your hands. And in some cases, people wanted to take their life into their hands, as is the case of Marie Orensanz that wrote here, Limitada, I am not free, I am kept in prison, I cannot express myself. And instead, here we see the work, more recent works of Carlos A. Morales, that instead talked about the same idea of censorship and not being able to speak openly by creating a fictional alphabet of like typographic characters that are then formed into letters and manifestos that, if understandable, would get the artist into real serious trouble. So in a way, the form of the characters, you can feel the dissent from the words. And the beautiful thing is also that these characters are formed using ocarinas. Ocarinas are musical instruments that are used a lot in Mexico. And every single one of those letters that are kind of emotional has a different sound. And played together, they form also melody. So you go from character to phonetic characters. So artists use these kind of transposition of words and characters in many interesting and different ways, and they have used that particular ability many times under political duress. Well, we can move then from the idea of words to the idea of languages, because in a way, the two are connected, especially in tonight's speech. And we can discuss very openly the fact that political imperialism is also language imperialism. And words also disappear together with languages when colonialism is reflected the way it is in this particular map. And as you can see, it doesn't matter how many people speak a language. The language is actually taking over politically and is unrelated to the number of people speaking it. And you know, there are many scholars that have discussed this particular problem of language colonialism. In particular, there's Elisabeth Moudimbe-Boilly that has talked about the langue volée, langue violée. It's like when a language is violated, it's also stolen. It's very difficult for anybody that's being oppressed to express her or his own oppression and dissent in the language of the conqueror. So it is really a conundrum and a difficult situation, and language is a weapon. Or I remember it was Language is a Virus. Who was Laurie Anderson, Language is a Virus. We didn't think about it that way, but I remember her performing that. And here is the map of the endangered languages, and Lena will talk about it much more tonight, Lena Herzog. But you can see here, the ones that are in green are at risk, and then the ones that are in red are severely endangered, and you can see how many they are. It's pretty terrible to think of the richness that is being lost. Now, interestingly, when we talk about units of meanings, there are many different ways to move from letters and words into other forms of codes. And quipus are maybe one of the most interesting forms. They're talking knots that come from a pre-Columbian, from Inca times, and that at first were understood to be just a quantitative kind of language. People thought that Inca, whose language has not survived for us to appreciate, used these as like forms of rudimentary and proto-senses. So it was a way to measure and actually to also sometimes regulate society. But some people think that instead they were also forms of poetry, that they actually had language. It's not very understood why the Inca civilization did not leave language behind, whether they really didn't have it, which is not very plausible, or if it was instead completely eradicated and erased by the conquerors. But these quipus, or talking knots, have remained as one of the most poignant and strongest forms of coded language, so much so that also Cecilia Vicuña, who's an artist from Chile, has used it in this beautiful sculpture that's called Quipu Womb. And that's just one of the possible examples of units of content that are not necessarily words, as are ideograms. Tonight we'll hear a lot about emojis, but emoji and hieroglyphics belong in the same family. Ideograms are units of meaning that are expressed with an image. And the same goes with Chinese. Chinese is a really interesting work by Xiaolan Sui, who is a Taiwanese woman that's been living in the West for a long time. And when she had 2 children and wanted them to learn Mandarin, she elaborated this whole way to teach them Mandarin by giving more explicit view to the Chinese characters. So it's really quite fascinating to see how many different possibilities there are to express meaning. And tonight we'll discuss all that with some great, great speakers. I will talk about them in order of appearance. We have Lena Herzog, who's a great art photographer and writer that has been involved in many different projects, but the most recent is called Lost Whispers, and it is about disappearing languages. It's quite amazing, and she'll tell us about it. Then will come, who's next? Jenna, yeah. Then will come Jenna Freedman, who's the Associate Director of Communications at Barnard Library, at the college, Barnard College Library, and also the zine librarian, the official zine librarian from Barnard College. She is stepping in for Emily Drabinski, her colleague, who had a pretty tough diagnosis just last week. So we wish her well. Hopefully she's looking at us. She's taking it in great stride and being very open and also humorous about it. And we wish her really well. And we also thank Jenna very much. Then we'll have Isha Datar. Isha Datar is the CEO of New Harvest, and she's an expert in cellular agriculture. And she has been dealing for a long time with this problem of how to call new ways to create things, you know, like meat in vitro versus synthetic meat versus new meat. She also works on eggs that happen without chickens, milk without cows. So she really knows how to deal with a new world that's beyond neologisms. It's really new objects. And last but not least, we will have Fred Benenson, who is very well known for many things, but in particular for having rewritten Moby Dick in emoji. So it's Emoji Dick. And also, he was a veteran of the salons because he was here for a previous salon about copyright and as when he was working for Creative Commons. In the midst of it all, we also have a few videos that are interventions from sometimes far away, sometimes from the 7th floor of this building, and that will punctuate our discussion tonight. So the first video can be rolled right now, please. No, don't worry about me.
Esperanto opened my eyes to the diversity of languages and to the fact that how a language feels, how it's experienced by its users, can be quite different to how it appears to outsiders. Terms like constructed language or artificial language or even international language, which are used to describe Esperanto, really do little to convey the experience of actually learning and using the language so that it becomes part of your linguistic and cultural identity. And that experience opened my eyes and got me curious in other languages, and in particular the indigenous languages of Canada and other countries around the world. Languages that have evolved in place over often thousands of years. On the surface, you might think that these languages are about as different from Esperanto as it is possible for languages to be, and yet they have something in common. Both Esperanto and indigenous languages exist outside the frameworks of, let us say, Western colonialism. Esperanto was devised as a deliberate attempt to resist and subvert some of the hierarchies that were imposed in the European way of managing languages. And of course, indigenous languages have been the biggest victims of that approach to language management around the world.
Help me welcome Lena Herzog, please.
Hello. Silencio, the politics of silencing. Silence, what might it mean? Does it mean anything at all? Could it be a signal of death or of possibility? A hand extended, as John Berger once said, or could it be the silence of despair? Maybe it means nothing at all. In the Spanish culture of flamenco, silencio, silence, is usually the most dramatic moment, coming after a great build-up in tempo and revealing of the entire song or a dance. It is then, in that silence, when your heart skips a beat. During silencio, the words and gestures get imprinted on your mind and, more importantly, your heart. When I began working on my recent project, Last Whispers, which is dedicated to dying languages, I was stunned by the sheer scale of this phenomenon, by the sheer scale of silencing. Every 2 weeks, a world loses a language. Out of approximately 7,000 languages spoken on Earth today, at least half will have fallen silent by the end of the century. Some people predict a far more radical future, or rather lack thereof, for the world's linguistic diversity. Many of these languages, having never been recorded, are vanishing without a trace. We're losing the knowledge, the variety of worldviews, cosmologies of indigenous communities that have for centuries been encoded in these languages and cultures. Let there be no doubt. This is a mass extinction. By definition, it occurs in silence, since silence is the very form of this extinction. I have just used an oblique form and passive voice to avoid naming the culprits, the agencies responsible for this extinction, for I am a good student. I'm a good student, I'm well trained in the thinking patterns of power structures that have always been dictated to us. And this is key to understanding the politics of silencing, because we know them instinctively. We can feel them. And we're too afraid to name it. So let's do it. Let me repeat the question. What are the thinking patterns that power structures demand, that they mandate? Never point at them unless you wish to be punished. Depending on the country, the century you are living in, if you do that, if you name the power and those who own it for what they do, you will be disappeared, killed, burned, stoned, or more effectively ridiculed, accused of having delusions of being conspiracy theorist. You'll be shamed, you'll be Twitter or Facebook stoned, or you may experience some or all of the above, each of which has only one purpose: to silence you. The way power arranges this is by engendering our thinking and feeling on its behalf and against our own interests. It's quite a number those in power do on us. We do their dirty work for them against each other. Feudal times, with their witch burning and actual stoning, had nothing on us. The effectiveness of mass control of minds and emotions. Thus, the constant noise, drowning out any clear thought, the noise of our own voices, tugged here, notched there, manipulated everywhere, through highly researched tools of simultaneously individualized and mass-produced networks of linguistic references, psychological perceptions made by and for power and those who own it and hold it. The sophistication in messaging in this country is unparalleled by anything any authoritarian or totalitarian state could have ever created. They didn't need to, they had force. This country's history begins with the very myths of nations' founding, and is continued through theory and instant application of various technologies made to hollow out meanings from words, facts from information. Edward Bernays, Walter Lippmann, Frank Luntz, to name just a few, various think tanks, culture wars, media wars, highly controlled networks of perceptions and trigger points in all of us individually and en masse. And for as long as power has existed, that has existed as well, except not as effective as now. They didn't do it through any carefully choreographed conspiracies of secret societies, but through a fairly open and crude conspiracy of greed, the overarching indifference to anything other than that which is to their benefit, the oldest, most effective conspiracy of them all, greed and control. These networks of messaging and perceptions can be deployed only in dominant languages of dominant powers. How would power, especially globalized dominant power in its culture, handle definitions, punish those who transgress them in the language they don't understand? How would they dominate such a language? The disempowered have always known that. And thus, languages are constantly being born and die in ghettos and prisons. Even identical twins are known to have created their own languages all over the countries, all with one purpose: to evade those who have power and control over them. Well, the power on its own side also knew that. It always knew that it would be difficult, if not nearly impossible, to control minority people because of this language and cultural barrier. It has obliterated, therefore, these other languages as much as it could, either by simple genocide or by squeezing out cultures, absorbing them, vanishing them, sometimes intentionally, most of the times just as a byproduct of conquest, cultural absorption, and domination. The Roman Empire alone is responsible for at least 800 to perhaps 1,000 languages because it killed those who spoke them. Nowadays, it's done through technological spread of communication in dominant languages and a near vacuum in cultural and media production in minority languages. As one of my favorite writers, Arundhati Roy, once said, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only those deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. Now, at this time of globalization and climate change, communities all over the world face deprivation and marginalization. The tragic irony is they give up languages on their own accord. They're soft-armed into adopting these structures, these cultures and languages, unless they wish to be profoundly marginalized and allowed to disappear. Very few cultures and languages bucked this trend. Hebrew is one of the extraordinary phenomena that did. Another one is Gaelic, as Paola referred to. Gaelic language was forbidden for 800 years explicitly by the British Empire, forbidden to be spoken, written, and taught to the children. After the bloody uprising, euphemistically called the Troubles, the settlement provided for the revitalization of the Gaelic language by directing policy and resources. It's the only way it works towards this goal. Gaelic instruction became mandatory because of that. Now the generation of people in their 40s and younger speaks Gaelic. They can speak to their grandparents, but not to their parents. That generation of the parents is an illustration of what could have happened to the Irish culture. The middle generation is shown as a cautionary tale, but Gaelic persisted not because of the luck of the Irish, but because of the stubborn belief of the young generation's grandparents that they had in their origin, and they fought for it, the will to fight. And yet they speak English as well, having thus become a fully bilingual people who are culturally rooted and worldly at the same time. Not every culture could do that. Most didn't. Dominant powers and cultures become dominant because, among other things, they're ruthless and efficient, and because they could control all resources, in particular the most important one, us. How we are, how we feel, how we think. If you can't name it, you can't think it. And so, that's why they're dominant. The rest are vanished by us, and more precisely by those who own the world's economic and political order. Anything that stood or stands in their way is destroyed or allowed to die. Janet Frame had a brilliant insight into the nature of silence as a black mirror, showing us not only those who we have vanished, but also who is left reflected, ourselves. In the scented gardens of the blinds, she had this revelation. People dread silence because it is transparent. It is clear water which reveals every obstacle, the used, the dead, the drowned. Silence reveals the cast-off words and the thoughts dropped to obscure the clear stream. And when people stare too close to silence, they sometimes face their own reflection. Their magnified shadows in the depth, and they frighten them. I know, I know. When a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? This old philosophical trope I took as an exercise in empathy. Does it matter that universes, cultures die all around us? I'd like to conclude by showing you the last couple of minutes of my recent work, an immersive oratorio composed entirely of those vanished and vanishing voices. While working on Last Whispers, I listened to thousands of recordings of extinct and endangered languages without knowing what they were saying, what they were singing about. I got addicted to them. They remind me that while we're drowning in the noise of our own voices, nudged here, tugged there, manipulated everywhere, we're floating on the ocean filled with the silence of others.
Nang mulia ni mes imsalto. Taptaos nang mulia ni malpema. Me rukano paketan kitiawi. Rukanon rong nafsan. Laken rumrona ngarumet matutol tiawi.
Thank you. And soon, Lena is working on a VR experience for Last Whispers, so you'll be able to feel it completely and immerse yourselves in it. So can we clue in the next two videos, please?
Is it possible to think of a language without gender markers beyond experimental literature? As in, is it possible to think of a language without gender markers that's used in a realm other than experimental literature? And the answer for me is, of course, yes. There are already many languages throughout the world that don't use gender markers, such as Japanese, Finnish, Hungarian, Georgian, the list goes on. And English is one of those languages now. We're seeing the increasing rise in popularity of gender-neutral pronouns in English, such as ze and they and mix. And they're only going to increase in popularity as people's lived experiences change and as more and more people don't identify as either gender and carve out these words so that they can hear themselves reflected in the English language. And we're seeing how language can be reinvented to overturn the status quo and to accommodate everyone. Language is never the problem. The problem is a society that refuses to accept and utilize language that can accommodate everyone.
Also featuring the star cat. All right, sorry, there was one video. I would like now to call Jenna Freedman.
Hi there. First off, I just really want to thank Paola and Erica for including me, and to Emily Drabinski for referring me. And I really want to give a shout out to anyone here who is fasting for Ramadan. So all power to you. Thanks for being here. I also am just like a little bit nervous and having imposter syndrome since I'm subbing for my friend. She's much more of a theorist than I am. Thank you. Oh my goodness. But I'm a practitioner, but I'm going to do my best. But art people terrify me a little bit. So I'm going to talk pretty much about the subject that Emily had proposed, and I actually do a lot of cataloging myself, so it's not completely foreign to me. But usually when I'm invited to speak somewhere, I'm invited to speak about zines. So if during the Q&A you want to talk about zines and alternative literature as a place for different kinds of words and different people that have words, please hit me up. So, okay. And the first thing you'll notice is I work at a women's college, so my slides are the college template. So I feel like my talk is about the default, and here the default is women. So the first thing I did is I made a tag cloud of the words from the Brooklyn Public Library website. This is the public-facing idea of a library. We have references to books and authors, to pop culture, to multicultural writers. There are references to teens and kids and learning and information. They reference tools and history, and I made it as a rainbow to make it feel extra inclusive. And I'm delighted to have been invited, for Emily also to have been invited to have librarians here, because in some ways we are the keeper of the words. So I thought it'd be nice to show the library. But not every library is quite as inclusive. And I have to warn you, this slide has animation on it. I was a little unsure as to whether to do it, but I thought I would. So the Library of Congress is the library of people, right? Not really. The Library of Congress is meant to be the library of the members of Congress, but the Library of Congress is the one that default sets the language for all of us. They have the committees, they have the power. So it's the Library of Congress, but it's really being dictated by what the cataloging body thinks that members of Congress are going to need. So it's like, there's like all kinds of levels of chilling effect there. So what we call in librarianship controlled vocabulary is words or phrases that are used to find all of the stuff. A classic example is, do you use the word, the phrase capital punishment, or the phrase death penalty? Because if you're a heavy-duty researcher, you want to find all the stuff. So you're going to look under one or the other of those two things and get it all. So that's what's called controlled vocabulary. We want everyone to be able to have the same access point. I don't like that phrase. Me and my zine librarian friends, we like the phrase mutual metadata. Why can't it be that? Controlled vocabulary, that sounds like controlling. We also, another phrase is authority control, but we like to say mutual metadata. So I want to show an example, and this was actually beautifully set up by Paola with her example of refugee versus asylum seeker. The Library of Congress classification for a while was illegal aliens. So you go into the catalog and you look up undocumented, and it brings you back illegal alien children, women illegal aliens, illegal aliens. A Dartmouth student was doing a bunch of research. She's undocumented, and she kept retrieving records that said illegal aliens, and she was feeling kind of microaggressed. In your library, which is supposed to be welcoming and about information and sharing, she got back this like really kind of harsh version of what the library, the capital L, thinks of her. So she kind of kicked up a fuss. Librarians took up the struggle, and they made a proposal to the Library of Congress people. They're called SACO, the Subject Authorities Cooperative. And so SACO, which I have a blog post that says SACO drives me psycho. You can look that up. So the Library of Congress was successfully lobbied to change the term. They removed the term illegal alien, and like we all thought, we won. We didn't. So what they did is they replaced it with non-citizen to describe the act of residing without authorization and unauthorized immigration. So the American Library Association, so a bunch of activist librarians were working hard against this. They passed a resolution to, say we don't like this. And the House actually got into this, Congress, who are the people the Library of Congress served. And they actually had a bill trying to keep in place the illegal aliens phrase. You think no one cares about library cataloging, but all of a sudden there's members of Congress trying to lobby to reinforce illegal aliens. There's a nice quote about this, I think in Library Journal. When ugly, belittling names are used to describe groups of people, those terms can make discrimination seem okay, Mr. Castro said on the House floor on June 9th in an effort to stop the provision from being included in the bill. So that was about how we describe things. Now I'm going to talk a teeny bit about how things are placed on the shelf. And actually, I think a previous speaker gave me a good setup for this too. You'll notice that I put a square around the word "the" in Bible. The Bible. It's not my Bible. Is it everyone else in this room's Bible? Maybe not. So, I mean, this is how the Library of Congress puts it. So if you go to the Bible, guess which Bible you're going to find? It's going to be all information about the Christian Bible. But amusingly, it's in the subclass BS, so we all get a laugh about that. So my next slide is called Where Are the Women At? Classification determines where on the shelf a thing belongs. So all of women are literally in a subclass. All right, I got ahead of myself. They're literally a subclass within a whole alphabet. Do we even get our own whole letter? We're not even H. We're HQ. We get a section of a letter, and we share it with family and marriage because, you know, that's what goes with women. How many of you love finding your section of the library or the bookstore, sitting down on the floor and browsing? Librarians like to say browsing serendipitously. Does anyone do that? Yes, people love it. But what I discovered as I was prepping this talk is serendipitous browsing is a lie. Someone has decided where this item belongs. And in a library the size of mine, we have 200,000 volumes. It's kind of okay. You can sort of like get more than just these little tiny numbers. There's a really good one. Erotica just gets HQ 449. So you can kind of get a grip on that. But at a library like Columbia University, which is affiliated with Barnard, they have 9 million books. So if you go to the HQ 449s, there are going to be shelves and shelves. Okay, thank you. Anyway, so it really matters where something is put and how it's described and where it's sectioned. So, and also, I think there were a few laughs, just checking out the progression under sexual life. You gotta love this movement from sexual behaviors and attitudes down to sexual deviations, bisexuality, etc. It's really not necessarily very nice. But what about, I think this is interesting also following Lena's talk, how do you find stuff about people with other identities? How do you write about, and also following the talk about non-gendered language, how do you write about people without othering them? But on the other hand, you don't want to assimilate people and just lump them all into one thing, because otherwise you'd end up not having any way to write about white dudes. If you look up, actually there is a Library of Congress subject heading for men, white, and you can find them, but not many books are described that way. So, but it's not like there's a lack of materials about white men. But if you want to study whiteness, that's actually hard. Okay, so that is the end of my talk. You can look up some of the stuff that I wrote. There may be extra handouts left over. And you can also relive this experience online on my blog. Thank you.
All right, next videos, please.
And this project is about studying how language, gender, and the diagnosis of heart disease are all connected with one another. Now, heart disease is the #1 killer for women, and 1 in 3 will die of heart disease, but 1 in 33 women will die of breast cancer. The prevailing stereotype, though, is that heart disease is mostly a man's disease. So much of what we know in the field of cardiology is all connected with cardiac symptoms and how patients verbalize them with respect to a man. In fact, 80% of all diagnostic tests in cardiac care happen for men. Only 20% of them are women. And this is because when a woman goes to a doctor, 99% of the time, an interventional cardiologist is a male, and they frequently cannot understand female symptoms as well as they do for male symptoms, because they are looking for quote unquote atypical symptoms to appear for women. The field essentially is waiting for half the population to turn up with atypical symptoms, whatever atypical means. And so women, when they go to a doctor, verbalize their symptoms in a very different way. They describe pain in a very different way. And often what happens is the doctor basically diagnoses them with something other than heart disease. Things like gastrointestinal disease or anxiety and panic attacks, so on and so forth. So when we talk of language, we can use artificial intelligence not for disease prediction, but actually to collect data and show in a very statistically rigorous manner that language is so important, and it's time we paid attention to the language used by women to describe something as serious as heart disease.
So good. Great. Now we're going to call Isha Datar. Come on. She's like, where are you?
I'm right here. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about naming the future of food. Specifically the type of future of food that I am focused on. And before we get into the naming side of it, I thought I would present the problem that I am setting to solve with the work that I do. And that problem is that animal products are excellent and delicious and wonderful. And it's very hard to find, for instance, a plant protein that can become stretchy and melty like cheese or frothy like a milkshake. It's also very hard to find a plant protein that can become a thick custard but also a fluffy meringue like an egg protein can. And it's incredibly hard to find a plant protein that can hold together fat and water as well as the muscle proteins in a hot dog. But the problem with animal proteins is that they ruin the environment. And from this aerial photo of a cattle feedlot, we can see that animal agriculture is actually changing the surface of our planet. Animal agriculture is also incredibly unsafe with the creation of antibiotic resistance and viral epidemics. And last but not least, the problem with animal agriculture, or the problem with animal products, is that they come from animals. And whether or not you're an animal lover, I think you can agree that a factory farm is a very unpleasant place. So my work is the creation of animal products without animals, with the kind of thesis that if the main thing driving meat production is the creation of boneless, skinless chicken breasts, why would we debone and deskin the complex chicken when we can just grow that from muscle cells and fat cells and so on, starting with the basic unit of life, the cell, rather than the very complex and beautiful organism, the chicken. So here's an example of products that are made of cells, like meat or leather, where the actual cellular material is what you're using. But there's also a kind of different category of products, which are the products that are made by cells. So for example, a glass of milk is a collection of proteins and some fats and some water mixed together. If all we want is a casein protein, why do we have to raise cows and keep them lactating for a very long time to produce that protein when we could simply transform a microorganism to produce that protein for us? We already use microorganisms to produce proteins for us in the medical world. Insulin is made that way, which is from the 80s. And then we also use it to make some food products too. Rennet, which is used for cheese making, has been made using a microbial process since the 90s. So this is kind of what I've been working on for the past 5 years, is how do we make these animal products without animals? And these are some of the very early prototype products that have been created. This is milk made from cell cultures without cows, eggs made from, or egg proteins for egg whites specifically, made without hens, and animal proteins from animal cells made without cows. But of course the problem is, how do we actually talk about this thing, because beef without cows doesn't really roll off the tongue. So over the past 5 years that I've been working on this, but even further back than that, many different words have been used to describe meat grown in cell cultures. I couldn't categorize which ones are most popular, but I roughly put it in the order of what I've seen, but this is not scientific. The first several words tend to focus on where this new meat comes from. So it comes from a science-y place, in vitro, lab-grown, petri dish, test tube. The bottom part of the list tends to focus on where this meat does not come from. It does not come from an animal. It does not come from a slaughterhouse. No killing is involved. And then in the middle, you have some terms that are kind of neither here nor there. It just tells you this meat is different, but it doesn't say why. So I thought I went through this kind of exercise, which is also not scientific, of plotting these terms on a little chart of positive versus negative connotation and how descriptive the actual word is. And of course, this is very subjective. This is my opinion. So the very first words, I think, very much focused on what was very descriptive, but not very positive. And I think that it's very understandable that this quadrant of words are the ones that we see very often used in the media because they are so shocking and stunning, but they do convey something meaningful, which is, okay, I get what lab-grown meat is. I can kind of put two and two together and understand that. And then on the far opposite of this quadrant is the very positive connotation, but we don't quite understand it. And I think that that's more of the kind of marketing world where we want to sell this product and we're going to talk about the positive attributes it has. And if you don't exactly understand what it means, then oh well. So we tend not to go in that direction, but it's definitely something that we've seen a lot of organizations use, and it makes sense. And then on this side, we have things which are my least favorite words, the frankenmeat and schmeat, which is just non-descriptive, and the connotation is just, I don't know, it's weird. And when Paola introduced this talk, she talked about words of the year that were nominated. Schmeat was actually nominated for Word of the Year in 2013, which was crazy. And I was watching a video of the nomination, like how they chose the nominations, and nobody knew what it meant. And that year in 2013, Schmeat lost to selfie, so that was a good choice probably. So the word that New Harvest and my organization focuses on using is cultured meat. What we like about it, actually maybe I'll go back to describe what we like about it. We like that it is somewhat descriptive. It's not crazy descriptive, but it's somewhat descriptive, and we like that the connotation is not negative. It relates to something that we may or may not be familiar with. And so I like that it was very searchable. When you Google cultured meat, you find what you're looking for, approximately. I also like that it was very food familiar because we already use cell cultures in so many foods. There's already cultured yogurts and fermented things, and so it's not too foreign for us to be using live cells in a food product and understand that it comes from a cell culture. I think it's also context familiar. You may have heard of cultured pearls or cultured diamonds. Those are the exact same thing that are just produced in a slightly different way. I like the context that brings, and I also love this second meaning of cultured, which is like sophisticated and kind of clever. I think that that's a nice kind of bonus feature to the food familiarity. But I think the thing I like most about it is that it's technically sound. We're actually producing meat from a culture of cells, and so when you say this to a scientist, they know what we're talking about. Now, Paola made it seem like I was very intentional in this whole process, but actually I'm not at all. I'm more observing it from afar. If I were intentional about it, it would be because no one cared. So I've seen that the number of names have only expanded over the past 5 years, and I would only really be able to control this conversation if I was speaking to myself. So this word, cultured meat, was actually created in 2011, or decided upon in 2011 by a group of scientists who met in Sweden, who decided that in vitro meat was probably not going to be the thing that really moves the field forward. So cultured meat is just one of the products, but really my work is focused on advancing this entire field of research and the scientists and the community that develop these products. And so we needed to not only name the products themselves, but actually this entire environment. For example, if we're going to fund a PhD student, what would their degree be in? If their focus of their work was producing foods from cells, what would the name of their school department be? So the only way I could do this this is back in 2015. The only way I could figure out how to name this thing was to go to our small community of people on Facebook. And I asked, what do we call a new discipline and industry focused on making animal products without animals? And this was back in March 2015, which is actually not very long ago. We had a lot of interesting ideas: cultured nutrition, cultured biofabrication, animal-free food innovation, engineered nutrition, post-animal consumables, and then I came up with this idea of cellular agriculture. And then cellular agriculture people started kind of reflecting and riffing on that idea, saying, hey, that's kind of cool because I know how to shorten that. I can say cell-ag. That kind of rolls off the tongue. And I liked when I looked up cell. In Latin, it means a small room, and I thought, hey, that kind of makes sense. We're growing agricultural products in a small room rather than in a field. So there's like a dual meaning there that I thought was very cool. And in general, people just started to really like that idea. And so that's how we settled on this name, cellular agriculture, to describe the production of agricultural products from cell cultures rather than from whole plants or animals. And I think it has really begun to stick because this morning I looked up how many Google hits we got when I Googled cellular agriculture, and it's 133 million. Yes, so it seems to be the one for now until someone else comes up with a better one, I guess. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Hey. All right, the next two videos, please.
絵文字がこれだけ世界中の皆さんに使っていただけるようになったのは、絵文字そのものが非常にそのモバイルのテキストコミュニケーションにおいて重要な役割を担うものだということを皆さんが感じていただけたからだと思います。その理由として私は大きく3つあると思っています。まず1つ目はテキストのコミュニケーション、モバイルの皆さんスマートフォンで文字を入力されますが、文字は非常に入力が簡単だということです。一つのテキスト、単語を打つよりも文字をそれに変わる1個、たった7文字ですから、それを入力した方が入力するのも簡単ですし、結果として長い文章を短くすることができます。2つ目は文字によってテキストを飾るデコレーションすることができて個性を出せるということです。実際にその絵文字、短い文章だとどうしてもその寂しい感じがしますから、そこに絵文字を入力することでテキストそのものを楽しくすることができます。で最後3つ目、これが一番私が大事だと思っているところなんですけれども、テキストに感情やニュアンスを加えるという、これが絵文字の最大の私は重要な役割だと思っています。
The ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic script was basically a writing system made up of phonograms that spelled out sounds and classifiers to signify word category. Hieroglyphs were used primarily for royal and elite monuments meant for eternity. Their dual nature as pictorial signs and written language meant that they could be creatively integrated with images. Hieroglyphs themselves could have power and magic. These vessels from about 5,000 years ago are beautiful, but more to the point here, their forms enhance their functions. This bowl for libations takes the shape of the word for pure, and this ritual dish literally spells out life to the spirit. These panels are from the wall of the 4,000-year-old pyramid complex. They are carved with the names of the king inside rectangles representing his palace, protected by the great falcon god Horus, a clear and visible religious and political statement. Smaller and meant for a more restricted audience, but no less potent, is this figure of Nektanibo or Noktorheb, carved 2,500 years ago. It graphically illustrates the king's name and again expresses his power and his relationship with the great god Horus, whose statue actually forms part of the king's name.
All right. Fred, please come to the stage.
Thank you so much for having me. I don't think I ever expected to be at MoMA talking about emoji, but here we are. Well, me in particular. So thank you. So this talk is titled Emoji or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Unicode, but it's not really about Unicode so much as my kind of trip through emoji to Unicode and then kind of where we find ourselves with language. So in 2009, I found myself obsessed with emoji. My friend's wife was Japanese, and she was sending it to us, but we couldn't send it back unless you downloaded this like illicit app from the iPhone store. And you could awaken your keyboard to get the emoji keyboard. And I would just send it to people, and they'd be like, what is this? What's on my screen? And I started writing fuller sentences, and I started thinking, what would it be like to write a whole book in emoji? And I was like, that's a lot of work. I don't think I can do that. But maybe I could translate a book in emoji. And I was working on copyright stuff at the time. And I was like, I bet I could find a way to translate a public domain book into emoji. Like, what would be the most inappropriate, just totally out there, it would not work, just be like offensively bad, like you shouldn't do it, book into emoji. And I was like, Moby Dick would be wild. Not only is it like super long, but it's like this just incredible work of literature that surely cannot be kind of condensed down into emoji. And I was like, well, I don't want to do that. That's a really long book. Maybe I can hire other people to do it. And around this time, Amazon Mechanical Turk was becoming a thing that people were experimenting with. And so I set up some simple tasks to run Moby Dick sentences through Mechanical Turk and ask people for translations into emoji. This is actually the first thing that came out of the system, and I was like, whoa, that's pretty good. That's like really good. Maybe I should do this whole thing. And I was like, maybe I can get somebody else to pay for it. And so I launched a Kickstarter project. I had a couple dozen people support me. It was like 83 books in total, but I made it happen. And it kind of set me off on this like weird course of becoming an emoji expert. These are some of the reviews people gave it. The best quote, which I put on the back of the book, was Emoji Dick doesn't seem very interesting by Damien Searles. He did a great project with the Moby Dick where he excerpted all of the parts that a condensed version took out and just called it semicolon or the whale. He's a famous translator, and I was like enormously honored he even knew what Emoji Dick was, but now his quote is in my book. I was also experimenting with some of the kind of like visual constraints and opportunities for emoji. This was a cover contest for the New Yorker that I submitted to. It didn't get picked, but Gawker wrote about it a couple of years later, and I was like pretty happy about that. I feel very differently about this slide now, but in 2013, the Library of Congress contacted me and asked for a copy of Emoji Dick, and I was like, wow, that's actually kind of a big deal. They're like, yes, it'd be the first emoji book in the Library of Congress. And I was like, are you sure you have the right person? This is a translation of Moby Dick. They're like, yeah, but we think it's interesting. So I sent them a copy, and I was telling a friend, and he was like, anybody can submit something to the Library of Congress. I was like, no, they asked for it. And here it is. Here's the little screenshot of it being in the Library of Congress. And now when you look up Moby Dick, it's actually listed as a official translation, which is just, I feel bad about at this point for Melville's history, but that kind of kicked off this whole other wave of like attention. And so I was like, I keep on experimenting and do these weird experiments with emoji. And so I made a little Twitter bot called Emoji Dreams, which just generated, spoiler alert, a random set of emoji that made it seem like somebody was thinking them. And I was like, this is just fun. It's kind of an inspiring thing to follow on Twitter. And then somebody created another bot called Emoji Freud, which tried to translate them. And I actually think this is a human writing human translations of emoji as a response to the dreams. And then I was like, I should make an emoji translation engine. So I'd launched another Kickstarter project, which didn't hit its goal. It was very embarrassing because I was working there. But it did land me in this book deal to write a book called How to Speak Emoji. And I got in a huge fight with a publisher about this cover because I was like, what is that? Like, what does that mean? And she was like, well, the poo emoji is the emoji. And I was like, what? And we got this whole meta emoji debate about what emoji represents emoji. And so I lost the fight, but it got translated into German, and it's sold tens of thousands of copies, which is kind of crazy. My favorite is the 1-star reviews on Amazon. It's well reviewed, it's a decent book, but these are parents who bought copies of the book for their kids and didn't realize it wasn't for kids. Nowhere in the book does it say it's for kids, but there's this implicit association because emojis are kind of cartoonish that it must be for kids. And so I still get these reviews where people are really upset about some of the lurid emoji jokes, which they're not that profane, but I think this speaks to kind of some interesting assumptions around emoji and who they're for and what they're used for. Just recently, I tried to come up with an emoji of my own. I thought I was going to be clever and do oyster with pearl and to kill two birds with one stone, but it didn't really cut it. Unicode, the standards body, has like incredibly strict guidelines for when they accept new emoji now. It's like a very interesting process. But I was like, I should try it again with just an oyster one. So I just submitted this a couple months ago. It sounds like it's made the cut. So I think oyster emoji will be coming out in the next year or two on your phones, which I'm really excited about. Okay, so like, how did I get here? And like, how did we get here? How are we paying so much attention about emoji? How did emoji end up getting taken so seriously that it could get acquired by the Museum of Modern Art? And when I really think about it, it kind of comes down to this idea that I loved by Matthew Barney, which is that constraints and restraints can spawn creativity. And that's really kind of how I saw myself working with emoji. Even going back to those original text messages with my friends and family, I was like, I have this like very singular palette that I have to choose from. This is the whole palette now. I took the screenshot a couple days ago. It was a lot smaller when I started, but it's like, I gotta choose within this a thing that represents the thought I have, and by combining it to something else, I'm doing this kind of like pseudo-language thing that's actually really interesting and demanding from a creative perspective. And I think that speaks to a lot of the ideas of what medium is in art and the way that people are constrained by their medium. And I think it's one of the reasons why that emoji are compelling. I also think this is why emoji are inherently political. Here are 3 examples that you might not have thought about, but are incredibly political, divisive debates, and started off that way in the emoji world. Which flags are included? Is Taiwan a country? Does it get its own flag if it's next to China? Is that a problem? These are whole things that the Unicode subcommittee didn't want to deal with, and so they came up with really ornate processes to work around it. I think the skin tone selection emoji set was a really good evolution, but I also think a lot of the food choices that came with the default emoji set are inherently political. They're incredibly biased towards Japanese culture. And I think that's actually kind of cool because most of the time stuff is biased towards Western culture and technology. And of course there's the gun. This is a set of how the gun has evolved over time. Microsoft actually started off as like the kind of goofy version, the like space taser, and then they went to the real gun, and then they eventually ended up back on the water gun, which was a really interesting evolution. People wanted to take the gun out of emoji, but since it's in hardware and in Unicode and everywhere on the net, you can't just delete an emoji, which is a really interesting affordance if you think about it, or constraint. Okay, so what does this mean for language? This is why we're all here and what we're talking about. I ended up in ground zero of this debate kind of incidentally. When I used to give talks about emoji, I'd be like, linguist trigger warning, I'm about to say some things about emoji that might be crazy and like language defying and that kind of thing. But I didn't really know what I was talking about. I studied philosophy, not linguistics. And so everyone wanted me to answer this question positively and say, yes, emoji is a language. I got kind of fed up with trying to argue that it's a language. Like, I don't think it's a language. And I came across a lot of other people who know a lot more about this than I do, saying much smarter things, which is that there's something like charades, or there are these like gestures. And I think there's something really to that. And I just want to take it off the table here. I'm not here to argue that emoji is a language or will be. I mean, we'll see where it evolves to and what grammar comes out of it. But right now it's not. And I think that's okay. Gretchen McCullough, who you should all look up when you get home, she's a great internet linguist. She tackles all the crazy things that are happening on the web, said that they were closer to gestures, and I think this is kind of where I net out. But are they destroying our language? This is an email I got a couple days ago. Somebody wanted me to go on a podcast in London to argue that to argue against the idea that children are finding it hard to express themselves, and emoji are making this a worse problem. This is from the like moral panic, pearl clutching side of the debate, which I declined to wade in on. I don't think this is actually a problem. Mainly because I think if emoji didn't exist, we'd probably just create them again. We live in the sea of text. All we do with each other is communicate with text now. That's different from how it was maybe 20 years ago and even before that. So I think we kind of need emoji. And I think, like, mentally speaking, when we're trying to communicate, our intentions get caught up in these like really weird places, especially over text messages. On the far left, it's just somebody like giving up and saying, I have to call you because this thing happened. In the middle, it's like somebody trying to make a emoji or something using text art. And then over here is like somebody breaking up over text. And it's just like the most deflating, like dehumanizing thing you can imagine. So I think we're just kind of in this dearth of emotive connotation inside text. And we need emoji to kind of do that. And this kind of speaks to what the creator of Emoji was saying before. But I think we can go a little farther. In the links they sent out, there was a great paper by Hamza Ashenquiti, I hope I got her name right, calling them a paralanguage. And this actually turns out to be a very well-studied area of anthropology and linguistics, which is another way of communicating language-like things. And finally, I'll end on this. This is kind of preliminary research. If there are any neuroscientists in the audience and you want to make a career for yourself, please tackle this because it's just the beginning of this area. And functional brain MRI scanning is kind of a dubious science to begin with, but the idea that emoticons and emoji are triggering similar parts of our brain that we use for facial processing and speech prosody points to the fact that emoji are actually being used in a way that's similar to the way that we convey non-language communication, right? Like our smiles and our feelings are getting conveyed by our body language, but now emoji are starting to kind of take up that role. So I think is a really awesome area of research. I think is really early on. So if anybody knows any scientists who want to dig on this, I would recommend it. So thanks so much.
Thank you. So the last two videos, and then we talk.
This is a yes and no answer in some way. Let's say yes, in that the viewer is politically biased or prejudiced in some way. And when they're viewing the abstract calligraphic work, they may think it reminds them of something religiously extremist or Islamic, or just plain, negative to them for some reason. In that danger, it could be perceived as politically charged artwork in some way. It all depends on the viewer. And for my art, I would say no, as I'm a abstract painter and I generally avoid political themes or religious themes. And I intentionally never use or write words in my paintings. And my ranges of influence go from Arabic, Asian, and Old English calligraphy to abstract expressionism and 80s New York City graffiti. So my influences are non-political in any way. Abstract calligraphy could be considered the new Rorschach test. What do you think?
A bicycle wheel attached to a stool. A humble pad of Post-it notes. Conceptual art. For many of MoMA's visitors, these prompt a lot of questions, and sometimes strong reactions. So, is it possible to change the way people see with words? I believe the answer is yes, though it can be especially challenging in a 100-word wall text. To do this effectively, we conduct research about people's most pressing questions about modern and contemporary art and design, and develop content that addresses those in an active and engaging way. Tone and voice are important. In some cases, humor and irreverence can shift people's attitudes and perceptions about what they see. We always strive to describe complex ideas in clear, straightforward language, and to address art and ideas from a contemporary perspective by correcting stereotypes and outmoded ideas, and writing with a sensitivity to diverse perspectives. We include visual cues to encourage people to look more closely, and most importantly, we use words to help empower people to form their own interpretations and connections, because more often than not, their words have the power to change how we see.
Our very own Sarah Benenson, that is actually sitting over there. So I would like to call my fellow co-speakers here and come and sit with this alien of extraordinary ability, or now resident alien. Sometimes I wonder, it's funny because when I moved into the country, I was dealing with immigration and naturalization services. and now instead it's Homeland Security. Sometimes I think that's kind of a newspeak. But thank you very much for your presentations. And let's talk politics. You know, it seems to me like what you're doing as a librarian is really politics. It's really quite amazing. Those that have the power to dictate the words that we use are actually are like using power in a very political way. So I wanted to ask you, Lena, you have said that you sometimes don't understand the words of the languages that you've been documenting. Do you ever try to actually learn them or to get to know more about those languages?
Of course, but quite a few of the recordings that I've listened to, they didn't have actually a dictionary, because to record and decode a language takes many years. So it involves creating a vocabulary, understanding grammar, and you would have thought, considering the scale of the phenomenon, that that would be an army of linguists doing it. But it's just a tiny battalion, and they all know each other. And by the way, my collaborator, Solom's University of London and Mandana Seyfudinpour and her linguists, as well as the Smithsonian and the Rosetta Project and a few others, I had about a dozen archives that worked with it. They are the ones who go out to Papua New Guinea, to India, to the far reaches of the world and find this, you know, one lost speaker. I just was 3 days ago in Peru, in the area of Madre de Dios, and I spoke and recorded Esieja and Gine, the critically endangered both, particularly Esieja. I mean, they are bilingual. They speak Castellano, they speak Spanish, which I understand, and their own language. However, some of the languages we didn't know, for example, the language Ingrian, that we had, some of it we knew, but some of it we didn't. And the song that we used as one of our arias is so absolutely heartbreakingly beautiful that we called it She Probably Sings About Love. We don't quite know, but it seems like impossible that she would be singing like that about anything else. On the other hand, we had a home, and there was script, and there was actually the lyrics of the song, and we know exactly what a home aria is about. That's language from India, critically endangered, and it describes the procession of the nobles and the elephants and this and that. But then it gets to really metaphysical stuff, and it says, it asks the spirits to come back, because spirits in a home culture are tender-hearted. And so when humans are their worst self, which is much of the time, they flee. And that song essentially says, we've had a war, and there was much blood, but we'd like the spirits to come back. And so we call that song Recalling the Spirits. And you see over the mirage of a man walking away, because it's a man's voice, you see the lyrics of the song scrolling over the screen in the oratorio. By the way, the oratorio that you heard, something went wrong with the sound. So you heard it at a fraction of its power.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Hopefully you'll come back.
You'll get the virtual reality experience.
Yes.
Are you screening the oratorium? Because there are many different ways to show it. You know, you had an installation at the British Museum.
Yeah, it
You're
opened
going to do the
at
VR.
It opened at the British Museum next to the room with the Rosetta Stone, the actual Rosetta Stone.
Which is so beautiful.
And the room for the living and the dying. And that room, you probably all know, it's most famous for its Hoa sculpture from Easter Island. And I think Queen Victoria got tired to have it, it's too big, and she just gave it away to the British Museum. And all the artifacts around were from places where our voices come from India, from Alaska. One of our voices is from Koyukon, from Alaska, from everywhere. And all of a sudden, you heard these ghosts sing and speak. The way that we arranged it and we called Immersive Oratorio is it's 8.1 system of public display and binaural. And we're working right now, we're actually inventing as we're going audio technology for VR tracking, because you will be entirely immersed in the VR of it with my brilliant team. And I'm working now with Emblematic, pioneering in VR team. And the reason we did it was not because we wanted to show off. The reason we did it is because the point was to elicit presence. And your ear registers sound that you hear normally, like for example that you heard here, as you picture, as you register a picture. So I know that the picture of Paola is not Paola, just like we know our brain somehow knows, but not so explicitly, but it still knows that the sound you heard wasn't the sound of these voices. Now when you hear it in 8.1, you actually feel like they're there. So you really feel their presence. So I wanted to raise the ghost, and it was a great thing to see at the British Museum. Londoners, there were about 80,000 people, according to the British Museum, who came to see, running around, listening and shushing each other for a change to hear them.
That's so beautiful.
So,
well, hope I'll get it soon. Isha, funny thing, while you were talking, I kept on thinking of Tom Wolfe. You know, he just passed away. And he was a magician at coining synthetic expressions that would really capture a moment like the me decade, or the radical chic. It's just, and your cellular agriculture in a way is the same. So you did not set out to coin neologisms or to be like so a groundbreaking literature, but you really got to it just by looking at the situation and just rendering it with as much clarity and also as much vagueness and ambiguity as possible, right? So I like that. It was a balance between clarity and ambiguity. How do you think your future will be as people will get more used to cultured meat? Where do you think that you'll go? Into more clarity or into a new species, like you're going to add another branch to the tree of life?
I think there's going to be more branches. And I've already noticed in the past couple of years that there's more branches depending on who the audience is and who you're trying to activate. And so a lot of our language and the words that we chose were because we were about cultivating a scientific community. So it was relatively easy to come up with those terms because we wanted things that were literally descriptive and kind of, we didn't even really try to make them not off-putting. It was more, we were just focusing on description. But now that there are some companies in the space and people fundraising around it, we're noticing a lot more terms that are more on the marketing side of things. And so when we say our scientific terms, I think there's a little bit of a friction there because it seems like we are rejecting these other terms when in fact we're just speaking to our audience. And I think all the different players in the field are speaking to their respective audiences. And as that audience grows, which is a great thing because it means that the idea is taking off and becoming alive, I think we're only going to see more words come up. But on the flip side of that, it's been a very interesting past couple of months because the Cattlemen's Association has created a petition saying that we should not be able to apply the word meat to things grown in cell cultures. And so not only are there new branches, but there's also protection over old branches that we're seeing. And I don't know what's going to happen to that, but it's
Erika,
interesting.
where are you? You had found out that meat was actually meaning completely different things. Why don't you? It's very interesting. Like at the beginning, meat was not meat.
Yes, I guess it's something that I discovered thanks to Isha a couple of months ago during a conference organized by Pioneer Works. And if I'm not wrong, the meaning of meat centuries ago was completely different. So meat just meant solid food. So people would refer to nuts or to whatever solid food as meat.
Yes, like nut meat or the flesh of a peach or whatever, yeah.
Now, Fred, there was this really interesting discussion about clarity and ambiguity in your talk. And it was kind of connected to Kartik and talking about women describing their symptoms and not being recognized as having a heart attack. So I was thinking of Italian versus English, because that's how I live. I find English much more precise. Like, I'm always amazed when I look at those ads that are like in the New York Times for like sales at Saks Fifth Avenue. Any kind of garment has a name. You know, there's like a wrap skirt. There's, I don't know, I'm always like amazed that there's like, shoes are called in different ways. And instead in Italy, usually it's shoes, and then there's like a gesture that describes the shoes. It's very fascinating. You know? So there's something like really precise. So I found it fascinating because the ambiguity of emojis and at the same time the limitedness of emojis is decided by a board. That is amazing, right? That somebody has the power.
It's so interesting that you mentioned Italian. I mean, obviously you mentioned Italian, but I'd studied Italian in college, and I barely remember any Italian, but one of the things I remember is come si dice.
Come si dice, yeah. How do you say?
How do you say? Because
yeah.
it would be like, that's all I need to know. That's like the one thing I can bootstrap with and just point and say come si dice, and then I'll be able to remember it. But correct me if I'm wrong, the Italian language has an academy. Right?
An academy?
Yeah. Isn't there
not like the French, kinda. I mean, we have an academy, but it's like we're not translating computer. L'ordinateur.
Fair enough. Yeah. No. There is this interesting thing where the contours of emoji are being decided by this kind of consensus of people, and it actually it's filled with people who work for Google and Apple and a number of other large technology companies. And for a while, they were just deciding on which characters from everything from Western alphabets to Indonesian to Cyrillic were going to get incorporated into computer systems. So they were just coming at it from a purely technical standpoint, and then they found themselves in the crosshairs of a very cultural and political and a meaningful one that carries a lot of semantic value and emotional value for people, and it strikes me that it's very similar to the Library of Congress, where they're like, hey, we just need a way to describe this thing, and somebody said illegal aliens, and it seemed fine at the time, and they don't realize that has these downstream kind of political consequences. And I think
Don't they though? I mean, really, can we trust them to be naive about it, or?
Well, I think the Unicode emoji subcommittee now actually deeply cares about getting emoji right from a representational standpoint, and that's where you see the skin tone stuff come in, and the push towards making guns not guns but water pistols, and it's a complicated subject because it's in people's cell phones, and it's just this like weird piece of technology, but then it becomes this thing in which people express themselves. So they're uncomfortable. I can say this for sure. They're uncomfortable with the role that they play, and so they don't like the fact that they have to be these arbiters of these cultural icons now.
Very fascinating, and nobody has thought of crowdsourcing that yet.
Well, the application process is open, right? I submitted it. Anybody can submit.
No, the decision.
The decision, no, that'd be interesting.
Yeah. And Jenna, the tyranny of normalcy. You know, it's fascinating. That's what I was thinking of while you were speaking. You know, the fact that on the one hand, the kind of default is white and usually masculine and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, the default is such that you cannot search it. It's really interesting. And also the new fluidity that is not represented yet by the archival. Is there a committee, like the Unicode committee, that kind of decides what the new pronouns or the new markers are that need to be introduced in archival systems?
Yeah, so similar to the Unicode subcommittee, there's that group called SACO that I mentioned, the
SACO,
Subject Authority Cooperative, I think. And so every month they release their, which new subject headings have been adopted and which ones haven't and why. And they refer to themselves as the meeting. So the meeting decided.
The meeting.
Yeah, it's really good. So anyone can propose a subject heading, which I do fairly regularly when I'm, especially because, I'm cataloging zines, so they have, they're about subjects that may not have been included in the Library of Congress before, or maybe they're like a pop culture thing, like zinesters are obsessed with, or zinesters from the 90s are obsessed with My So-Called Life. So I don't think
And understandably so. It's a great TV series.
It was a great TV series. It's true. We have a zine called Demon Angela that's about her. So anyway, I'm not responsible for establishing that heading. I'm just throwing it out there that it exists, and I've employed it. But so there's a form you can submit, and typically I'll refer to holdings in the Library of Congress to say, see, you should accept white privilege as a heading, and this is why. They've rejected it twice. And others can do the same. I'm going through like the less official way of doing it. At most research libraries, they'll have like the NACO person, which is the name authority cooperative something, or the subject authority person. So there's like a
NACO, SECO.
NACO and SECO.
Okay.
So the requests go up through them, but now the Library of Congress has this alternate means of proposing it, and to their credit, the meeting does discuss all the suggestions they get, presumably.
Well, this leads me to another big discussion that then I'm also opening up to the audience, which is the idea of political correctness. For instance, I've always been quite uncomfortable about the whole gun emoji situation, because isn't it hypocritical to make it into like a toy gun when it's still a gun? You know, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge problem because the meaning actually changed. And there have been a number of really weird court cases where somebody used a gun emoji and a cop emoji, and that ended up turning into a threat, which got litigated, and somebody actually got in trouble for threatening a cop on a Facebook post. And if that happened in 2018 on Facebook, it'd be water gun cop, and it probably wouldn't rise to that. And so the trend within the vendors to move the gun back from being literally a gun to a water pistol actually semantically changes all of the phrases that were written with that emoji in the past, because it's just rendering from the most current operating system update. And so it's a huge problem, and it was incredibly divisive. And yeah, it's one of these things that comes up when you're trying to build a software standard that everyone has to use. And yeah.
Also because words exist in context, and that's another big issue that happens with so many words, depending on how they're used and by whom.
But what is interesting is that it has real-world consequences. Because, for example, one of the things that was fascinating to me about use of force and cops is this expression, suicide by cop. And this is a fascinating expression. It's like as if something happened to a cop, even though the cop was the one who killed the person. And so it all of a sudden you have suicided by cop, and apparently it's really, really used. And another one is that, but it's always happened because power always tried to spread the demagogic we, which is why, for example, it's so hard to find white, because it's just sort of ubiquity is the way to hide it, which is like incredibly apparent. And if you think about the most important things that we're not talking about, it's just because they're so bloody ubiquitous.
Yeah.
But also real-world consequences. For example, waterboarding in Inquisition was called toka, touch, which is kind of nice. And yet they waterboarded. When the Japanese waterboarded American prisoners, they called it the water cure, which almost sounds healing. During the Bush administration, waterboarding, the exact same procedure, was called set of alternative techniques and enhanced interrogation. Now, there are real-world consequences to this because it was so obfuscated that we actually are kind of without tools to even think about it, when the proper word is torture. And so we have a real-world consequence. Now, the person who is actually was notorious within the agency, Central Intelligence Agency, is now going to head it. Because we've passed 2 decades, almost, not even thinking about it, not calling it a name.
Absolutely. Calling names is powerful, yes. So I would like to open it to the, Susan, you first, yeah? Yeah, you're getting the microphone.
Lena, thank you for that comment. I want to turn it around a bit. The the obfuscation,
Yeah.
and the lack of tools to deal with that.
Yeah.
I think inattentiveness to words is partly responsible. The subtleties of language. I mean, it's a very white elitist position, I suppose, but we are comfortable with shorthands. I'm not saying there isn't a place for shorthand. Punctuation marks were a kind of shorthand before emojis. But it seems that there's a quality of reductiveness to communications in general that, you know, I'm the pearl clutcher maybe. I'll admit it, but I do think we need tools. We need translators. That's really the bottom line. I think we need to become more comfortable as translators, so that we understand that it's not only our perspective that we're listening to. The other thing I would say vis-a-vis power, and this is then I'll shut up, is the power behind the emoji seems to be a power to infantilize to me.
To what?
Only
Infantilize.
Infantilize. And I say that, I know it's really, I'm being extreme, because the form language is cartoonish. It was so encouraging to see your oyster, because you even talked about the contours of emojis. You weren't speaking literally, but the form language is definitely childlike.
So?
And that we are adults, right?
Are we? I mean, but
do we talk baby talk to each other?
I mean, how many times have you heard somebody wish that they could think like a child about the world? The open-mindedness and the ambiguity.
But what happens when someone dies and I get an emoji with somebody
everywhere.
crying? I mean...
But that says more about the person who wrote it than the emoji, right?
Fair
It's
enough.
a convention, yeah.
What I like, I think the best emojis are the ones that are the hardest to find, because you don't know what the keyword is to look for them, because it's some kind of funny expression. And so I wonder what the upper end of the emoji thing is, because I now find myself spending so much time looking for the right emoji when if I actually had just typed it out.
There's this Japanese emoji keyboard. It's just absolutely beautiful. No color, and it's exquisite.
And so, but how do you find the emoji within the keyboard?
In the meantime, I'm gonna queue to the next one. I'm gonna go Shita, and then I'm gonna go to Jane, and then I'm gonna come to you. Hi.
Thank you all. And this is actually a question for all of you. Obviously, these different ways of interpreting the world around us change culture, or like influence or shape culture in some way. But since we're in a specific political moment, I wanted to ask each of you, how do you think these forms that you are all dealing with in terms of Library of Congress and organization of information, emojis versus science versus thinking about extinction of languages, how can these forms be used as ways of resistance or protest in the current climate that we're in? Do you see a future or a space where rethinking or these ways of communicating, new ways of communicating, right, or reorganizing words that are familiar to us can be forms of pushing back against things that we are trying to fight for individually or collectively?
Jenna?
Sure. I feel sad about the question, but I'll still answer it. So I mean, I think that they're proposing new headings is a form of resistance, or the library activists that made illegal aliens such a big deal that the New York Times wrote about it. That is a form of resistance.
Or what happened with Gaza 2 days ago.
Yes. But also, I mean, this may not, so in the library, we can reorganize things. One of my coworkers had an event, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was called. It was the Black Unicorn Library, I think. And so they sort of crowdsourced among students and faculty what books would be held in this space. And they created a living room in the library that was focused on Black people. And so that really transformed this library. It was Smith College, where my colleague was at the time, you know, which kind of has like a little bit of a hoity-toity white feminist kind of thing. So I think a different group of people got to have ownership of the space.
Two things. One, if you feel passionately about emoji not being in the Unicode set, you should definitely write a proposal. They are very open and very interested in hearing about that. Two, I'm forgetting which ones exactly, but certain emoji have already been banned in China because they took on a political connotation.
Oh.
I think it might have been the bunny, and then there was another
bunny?
one. Yeah, and because Chinese has all these incredible associations between the word and the way it's pronounced, and if you pronounce it slightly differently, then it means a totally different thing. And so these very innocuous little characters can kind of take on their own form. And I think the letter N got banned for a moment a couple months ago. And so all it takes is one person throwing it up and saying, this is what this means now. And a political movement could be formed around it. And I'd love to see that in English for emoji. I know I've been using orange plus clown a lot recently, and that has been my political emoji act of recent.
Because my work is at the intersection of food and science, it's definitely very political. And I think one thing that we try to do is to dare to err on the side of science rather than food when we talk about what we're doing, because we think it's so important to be descriptive. And we are constantly thinking about how do we avoid the situation of GMOs and so on by just being upfront about what we're working on while we're still working on it, rather than 10, 20 years after everyone's been eating it. So,
of course, also the science compliant or whatever was banned from the health department budget last year. So
yes,
it's not like you're getting away with it. Yeah. Lena?
Well, in terms of the project that I did, what I have been seeing are activists, language activists that are really working very hard to preserve it. It's a very uphill battle for each one of them, but it's incredible. And it's taking off more and more in that regard. But generally, how to understand what is going on, I think the best way to equip ourselves is frankly reading, and reading literature. Actual Moby Dick, no offense. Because when we read and we really we start to restore meaning to words, and all of a sudden, for example, I just reread Kojève's Introduction to Hegel, which is a really kind of a dense book, and all of a sudden I'm reading the first chapter, and it reads like radical literature. And it's an extraordinary thing to just even think like that. And another thing that I've been doing for the past 10 or so years is hate reading. Hate reading, yes. I do hate reading. So I read, for example, Bernays of Frank Luntz, because I want to know what the enemy does. So when I'm reading Edward Bernays, he was actually a genuine jerk. So he did not know that what he is writing is incredibly awful for culture. So, for example, recently I just reread his take on Enlightenment and Renaissance, and his take on it is that it was all PR for France. It wasn't about ideas. It wasn't about humanism. No, they were just, plugging it for France and for French Empire. So a lot of that hate reading is super helpful. Another thing, how do you understand also what you're getting about in the news? So looking back at history, how history has been portrayed before and what you know now, especially in the United States, which is a very open society. You have Freedom of Information Act. So another hate reading I do is I read the declassified CIA reports, and then you take a look at how they were described at the time, which is radically different from the truth of it. And the most revealing article I had read recently was on Truthdick, which is Bob Shear blog, which I advise everybody other than Intercept. That was a blog written by a man who was condemned, and he was on a death row, and then DNA evidence exculpated him. He was not guilty at all. He was never at the scene of the crime, had nothing to do with it. But he was African American, he's African American, and in the court of public opinion, he was condemned. And that gave him a tool and a real understanding of what propaganda means. So he describes how he reads the news, and he says, I read about the United States from outside the United States. So particularly if you speak any language, if you can read French, I read Libération very frequently. It's very revealing. And that's not to say that they don't have their own agendas, but it is to say that all of a sudden things come into relief, and you get outside of the Marvel comic universe that we're all lulled into, which is why I actually have a little bit of a reservation about emojis and Emoji Dick. It's not that I would mind it if it was alone in the set of grown-up culture, but because the culture is so infantilized, and we are being infantilized over and over and over again, to the point that our culture is so radical, and we don't even see it because we're not equipped for it. Not just in our language, but in our attitudes.
We don't have much time left, and there's so much that we haven't touched upon. We haven't touched upon the fact that a smaller vocabulary means a smaller mind, and I'm referring to the orange, what was it? The orange?
Orange clown.
Yeah, orange clown. Have we touched enough upon race, for instance? We talked about gender, we didn't talk that much about race. I mean, there's so much. If we had one last thing to talk about, what would you like for that to be? Is there something that we haven't yet touched? Over there? Yes, please, Krishna. Yeah, it's coming.
Hi. Thanks for the great evening. We've talked a lot about why words matter, and I'm wondering if someone can touch upon why it matters to speak words freely, if that freedom exists. The assumption behind why words matter is that there is a space to speak freely. And I think, even though I don't use emojis, I'm very curious about the spaces of freedom that possibly emojis offer, with their obfuscation, with their stretchiness and flexibility, and whether there's a space of freedom in the world of emojis to, as B.S. Johnson would have said, exeleutherostomize, which is to speak out freely.
So one thing I didn't get a chance to respond to about that Shigetaka mentioned in his video is that emojis help clarify, and I disagree, and I think this is kind of along the lines of what you're asking. I think that the joy, if it can be said, of using emojis in their ambiguity. And I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that that represents a kind of freedom, but it unbounds you from text. And whether that's risky or problematic given our current circumstances is open for debate. But I think as a medium, it is interesting and worth talking about. It's hard to answer the deep question about what freedom of speech looks like right now. I'm not equipped to do that. Yeah, I'll have to think on whether or not emoji is helping or hurting in that respect.
Well, it seems like, the codes, you were talking about, Lena, the codes that twin brothers, twin sisters form in order to escape authority. I think that sometimes emojis or other languages, or even just normal words used in a different way, were ways for oppressed communities to express themselves until they are caught. And that's what you were saying, that in China, certain emojis are banned. So basically, you keep on, there are places where freedom of speech exists, and I'm spoiled. I never experienced lack thereof. I don't know if any of us really experienced it, maybe somebody in the audience. But I feel that what we've seen, we were looking at the Radical Women exhibition at Brooklyn Museum, for instance. There are examples of that happening there. But we've reached the end of our night. It's 8 o'clock. I mean, end of our night in the theater. Outside, as you know very well, as I always say, there's so-so wine, snacks, and really great conversation. But I would like to really thank you. That's like work. Thank you for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Erica. See you outside. Thank you.